everyone. I think we'll get started now. It's 9:05. My name is Carrie Hogard, and I am the Vice President of Membership for the American Health Law Association. I want to thank you for joining us for this Health Law Week event to talk about the inclusion of people with disabilities in the delivery of legal services. If you could mute your line if you're not talking. If you have questions during the presentation, I'll be monitoring the chat, so please drop those in and we can get those to Kim Looney, who is going to be facilitating the discussion. Kim is our chair of the Membership and Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and then she's also joined by David Cade, AHLA CEO. There will be time for Q&A after Kim speaks, and so welcome again. Kim, take it away.
Sure. I do want to welcome everybody, although Carrie so ably just did that. But given that this is the first day of AHLA Law Week and that it's 8 Central Time, I think it's pretty safe to say that we are kicking off Health Law Week this morning. So we appreciate all of you joining. I wanted to give you a little bit of background about sort of what the genesis for this AHLA Disability Roundtable has been and why we've included it in AHLA Health Law Week. So the MDI Committee recently hosted a roundtable to discuss inclusion of persons with disabilities in delivery of legal services. As the chair of the MDI Committee for AHLA, I had the privilege of being on the planning committee with Joanne Lax, Galvina Stevenson, and Suzanne Scrutton. I'm sorry none of them are able to be with us today. The panel that was put together included Joanne Lax. Joanne is an AHLA board member and a retired healthcare lawyer from Dykema-Gossett in Michigan. And she's the upcoming chair of the MDI committee, so I'm excited that she will be taking over. Kevin Hara is an associate in Reed Smith's Life Science and Health Industries Group in San Francisco, and Sharon Krever-Weisbaum is the managing partner of Brown, Goldstein, and Levy in Baltimore. The participants included diversity officers, decision makers, general counsel from law firm and in-house departments from across the country. So the takeaway that we have from that the AHLA is working on a best practice summary for the inclusion of people with disabilities in the delivery of legal services roundtable, and it's in the process of being finalized. Your ideas, observations, and suggestions and best practices that come up today in our discussion will be incorporated into the summary, and you'll be notified when that resource is available. Of course, no one and any of their comments will be identified in that resource. So during the discussion that we had, I wanted to point out some of the things that some of the people brought up because I think that they're very interesting. Joanne talked about her personal experience with visual impairment, working in a 500-member law firm, some of the barriers and some of the challenges in doing that. She said as far as technology is concerned, it's more than just purchasing what might be appropriate technology, but the training, support, and integration of that technology. She said that one of the things she was able to do was to make friends with somebody in their IT department so that when she had issues, this person basically put themselves kind of in her shoes and was able to help her much more ably than somebody else might have been able to, because they basically imagined what she was going through and then worked to help fix those problems. She said client development and retention is another area, and that was kind of the theme throughout that roundtable discussion, that you need to make sure the people with disabilities are included in client development and that you work hard to retain them in your law firm. She said some of the logistics, in particular for her, because she has a service animal, that people need to know the rules regarding service animals and to stick to them, that these are not, your buddy, your friend. These are actually a working animal, and they are not a pet. And promote the culture of inclusion, including the social side of inclusion. So it's important that everyone be mindful of the people with disabilities and work to make sure that they feel included as part of the firm. Kevin is the co-founder of Leaders, which is a disability group with about 150 members, and Leaders stands for Looking for Excellence and Advancement of Individuals' Disabilities at Reed Smith. So they have a pretty robust program. They have disability diversity, and the mission is to support, recruit, and retain people with disabilities, and not just people with visible disabilities, that there are non-visible disabilities that also need to be taken into consideration. he was talking about the disability smart process, that once you get the people in the door, it's not just enough to get them in the door, that you need to have mentoring programs, accommodations if those might be necessary, that a compressed work week, decreased travel, adaptive equipment, any of those types of things. And also that there's potentially a disability etiquette guide. Don't just guess. It's okay to ask if the person needs assistance, and your firm should provide training. And his viewpoint was that the firm should give billable hour credit for that training. That would be one way to help ensure that everyone gets the appropriate training that they need. Sharon is an attorney, and she represents disability organizations, so she's very mindful in what she does and what her firm does. She indicated that the tech solutions can be very difficult, and one of the things that they have talked about doing is sort of a internship program where you bring a young lawyer in for a few years to help them launch their career. So you bring them in, you kind of take care of them, you mentor them along, you make sure they understand the process, that they get their feet wet and really get a strong basis in the practice of law. And they also have Braille business cards, which I thought was interesting. So with me today to help facilitate the discussion is David Cade, who's the Executive Director of the AHLA, as y'all heard. And we're hoping to have a robust discussion among the participants on this call. So I was just kind of going to start out with one question, and that would be, the first question would be, why is it important to include and engage persons with disabilities in the workplace and through our work with clients? And I'm going to open that out. Carrie, people can actually speak, right? They don't have to do it through the chat room?
No, they should be able to speak, yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. I'm just kind of getting the logistics settled, and it occurred to me that if I throw out a question, if I needed to be kind of trying to check the chat room and then repeating what people are saying, that would probably not be the most efficient way to handle this. So I'm glad that we have it covered. So I'm going to repeat the question one more time, since I kind of got off track with all this, and ask, why is it important to include and engage persons with disabilities in the workplace and through our work with clients? I'll throw that out for anyone who wants to start speaking.
One of the things that I remember, Kim, in response to your question is just, and I won't get the statistics correct, the economic statistics, but one of the things that I recall, to your question of why is it important, we're talking about a huge portion of the population that is not fully engaged. And the economic benefit to organizations, whether it's law firms or other business operations, is tremendous when we are open enough to bring anyone and everyone in who's able to contribute to the job at hand. It does support the economic base. And so I would imagine that for those who have an eye on the balance sheet, if we can't shift folks to list the right thing to include everyone, to be as inclusive as possible, there is a huge economic benefit. And to the point you raised about the panelists, all of them understood and shared their experiences about the economic benefit to the organization to bring in everyone who's able to contribute. And we learned that this is a very stable group of folks who've just been ignored over the past many years.
Well, and I'm going to go back. You mentioned some of the research that's been done, because I actually have some notes on that, and the numbers are pretty staggering. Accenture was a company that identified 45 companies that stood out for leadership in areas specifically related to disability, employment, and inclusion. And those champions were compared with other companies in the sample, and they performed above average financially. On average, they were 28% higher revenue, double the net income, and 30% higher economic profit margins over the 4-year period that they analyzed. So those are pretty staggering statistics. While I'm sure you can't say that all of that necessarily was related to their efforts with people with disabilities, certainly some of it was, that they certainly, were not harmed by doing anything in that way, and not just because it was the right thing to do, but because it also benefited the bottom line. And I think sometimes, I just want to mention one of the things that that has always stuck with me all these years is that Vanderbilt Law School, for instance, did not have handicapped access to the law school until 1987, because that was the first time apparently they had had someone enter the law school who needed handicapped access, who was in a wheelchair. And it was kind of staggering to me that as long as the ADA had been around, that I guess until you actually had someone who needed the access, they didn't actually have to put the access in. So I remember, it was the person in class behind me in law school, and, all of a sudden there were ramps, because there was literally no access to the law school except with stairs. And that's, when you start thinking about that, it's interesting to, to some extent put yourself in their shoes and think that they wouldn't have even been able to get in the building itself without some accommodations being made. So, one other, I'll just go ahead and bring this one up, was I took my son to Hong Kong. My husband was on like a 3-month secondment there, and he was 16 months old. There was no handicapped access anywhere. I think that at that time in particular, Hong Kong was one of those places where you kind of shunned your people with disabilities to places where they were not visible. And I can remember, him and his stroller, and being very happy that it was a lightweight stroller, because by the time you added him to the stroller, anytime you went up and down stairs, and there was one particular place that we went quite frequently, it was like 25 stairs. You're picking up the stroller and you're carrying him up the stairs, and thinking, once again, I can't imagine, that this being in a wheelchair and not having access to some of these buildings. So I think that we're better now, but I like that this Disability Roundtable is taking it a step further, and not just access to buildings, but access to opportunities.
I agree, Kim. I think we are better now, and yet not wanting to sit. Your example is so real. We don't know what we don't know until we experience it. And with a stroller or a wheelchair, many we don't see. We're not aware. And when it touches home, you realize we still have a lot of work to do. I remember an award ceremony some years ago, and in the tradition of this particular organization, they were always in this stately auditorium. It was not accessible. We were always there. And because the workforce hadn't had anyone who was receiving support in a wheelchair or who needed any assistance, was never top of mind. And the day came when someone was being honored, and moments before the curtain was to rise, folks realized there's no access to the stage. It was impossible. There wasn't a ramp, there wasn't an elevator, it was impossible. And when we talk about flexibility and being adaptive, the thought was, okay, now what are we gonna do? People were coming into the hall. One idea was, we will lift this individual up or take them out of the wheelchair and move them up so they can be on stage. The other option that was discussed, which carried the day, was that's extremely disruptive, not really cool, and could have medical challenges and risk associated with it. No one there was really trained. And so in the effort to be more open, they decided, let's just have the ceremony in front of the stage. Now, it changed the visual vantage point, but it allowed everyone to be able to participate equally. You could get into the building, you just couldn't get into the auditorium. So we were able to make that quick pivot, 5 minutes, to say everyone would just press, and the dignitaries came down, so everyone was on the front part of the auditorium, and it went over well. Fast forward, folks realized we need to upgrade and make this auditorium as accessible as the building was. Now, because the building had a ramp, and the building had elevators and braille inside the elevators. It was an old 1930s building that had been upgraded through the years, never in the auditorium. And I think it's just a lack of awareness oftentimes. And while we struggled through that moment, it was a teachable moment, and it allowed folks to realize we can do better. We can be more inclusive if we just learn and grow as we experience these things. And the other part is, as we enter into rooms, is to be aware. Am I the only one who can navigate this space? What about others? What about strollers? What about wheelchairs? And right, it's still a challenge today. And I think you're right. The roundtable was a great way for folks to come to the table and share what they're doing, what they're observing, in an effort to help everybody improve and be more inclusive.
Well, and I think you're right, because I think when, we have thought about MDI, we have not necessarily focused or thought as much about people with disabilities. And I think that's something that is a little bit behind the curve and obviously needs a lot of improvement. And I think a lot of it is awareness and self-awareness. And I thought that Kevin's comments during the presentation, because firms focus so much on the billable hour, that, providing the training, providing what people need, and even the etiquette training to understand what you can do and can't do and how you should do it, and giving people billable hour credit for that would certainly promote. It's definitely a step in the right direction. I guess let me put it that way, that, that is something, and in particular for young attorneys to, you struggle to get all your billable hours in. So if this is something that can count toward billable hour credit, that's something that will ensure that you have greater participation rates.
Yeah.
And I do think, I'll add that I do think that it's, AHLA has been on a journey, because when I first started, it was all about the commitment of, statement of commitment to diversity, and we had a diversity council. And then inclusion became an important component. So then it was diversity and inclusion. We started saying DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then we're really moving in the direction of IDEA, which is inclusion, diversity,
Equity.
Equity and accessibility. So we are recognizing that it really is multidimensional, and we're doing strategies in all of those areas.
Yeah, this is Jim Flynn. I'll just add to the discussion this way. As a business leader, the why question for me has two really, I've learned really two important elements. Number one, the invisible population that you referenced in your opening comments, Kim, is much more present and large than people realize. And so, David, while you're right to think about the situations where you have, wheelchairs and the visibly disabled, I think we as business leaders need to recognize that there's also a fairly significant invisible population that has to deal with limitations that can be overcome. They need the right accommodations. But the second thing that I've noticed is that there's a lot of talent in that population that we're missing out on if we don't take those efforts to be inclusive of them. And I've yet to run into an organization that says we have too much talent. I mean, talent is one of our most challenging aspects of our business. And so, I'll use our colleague Joanne Lax as an example. One of the most knowledgeable long-term care lawyers in the country. Doesn't matter that she's blind. She's one of the most knowledgeable long-term care employers or lawyers in the country. And so there's a talent argument to be made for this as well.
No, totally agree with that. And I think you're right. The visible versus the invisible, and the talent that you lose out on if you do not do what needs to be done to make sure that people are included. One of my husband's law school classmates was blind, and I remember that basically he had somebody who read all the cases to him. I can't imagine what that must have been like. And I do remember that when he graduated and walked across the stage, the person who had been his reader all through law school walked across stage with him. And it was just, it almost makes me tear up now thinking about it, but I know that the person got a standing ovation, and it was just, I can't imagine, it's hard enough to go through law school without a disability. I can't imagine trying to do it with a disability, and in particular one where you cannot see, because it's focused so much on reading and reviewing things. And it just, to me, it would seem insurmountable. Yet if you don't make an effort and make sure people are included, you're right, Jim, the talent that you lose out on is just, what a waste if you don't take advantage of that. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to add on basically our first question was, why is it important to include and engage persons with disabilities in the workplace and through our work with clients? And I feel like, we've come up with more than just because it's the right thing to do. It economically benefits the organization. As Jim pointed out, there's a loss of talent if you don't take care of it. And I think there were even, I know we mentioned one study earlier, but there was another one, the Kaleidoscope group based in the UK did it. And basically some of the statistics that they came up with, that there was up to 70% higher customer, client, and supplier engagement through disability inclusion, which enabled companies to capture and increase market share. I thought it was also one of the things they found is that disabled talent is more dependable. They have better attendance and retention rates, which reduces your business and HR costs. So that one says as much as anything. And basically the brand and reputation of the company are boosted through, taking advantage of their corporate social responsibilities and basically getting back to the argument that it's the right thing to do.
The other thing I guess I would add to this, Kim, and that is to be top of mind that, it is always helpful to have individuals in your organization, in your boardroom, whenever decisions are being made for the populations that we serve. And I think in the healthcare arena, we're serving everyone. There is no one who doesn't get touched by the healthcare delivery system. And when organizations, whether it's a law firm or a hospital or health system, does not have individuals representing the community served, I think you are at a disadvantage. You don't know what you don't know. You're not actively engaged in a very inclusive environment. You're guessing, you're assuming, and those are never strong foundational elements when you're making policy decisions. And so I would imagine, and I don't know, that the healthcare arena is perhaps a little more progressive in being open and inclusive, not just the law firms engaged in health law, but from the clients that are served by the legal and the professional community. I'm perhaps a little more hopeful than that this is a core group that is leading the effort for inclusion.
I think you're right about that. And I think when I think back to some of the, just even an AHLA statistic, that health lawyers have a tendency to be a lot of areas of specialty in law are more male dominated than female dominated, but health law, we have roughly 50-50 male and female in the Health Law Association with AHLA. So I think that points something out also, that you've got a group of people practicing law who already start out a little more inclusive than other areas of law. So I think that's something that helps advance it, at least for healthcare companies and law firms. So I think I'm going to go ahead and move on to the second question. And that is, what do we mean by disability inclusion and why focus on it? I think that we've touched a little bit on it in the first question, but let's try and drill down a little bit more on what disability inclusion means and why we need to focus on that. I think one of the things, let me go back to what some of the things that were brought out in our initial roundtable, because I thought this was interesting, is that, it's not just paying lip service. I think that's part of it. But when you talk about what you do with the disabled lawyers, if you have a cocktail party or something that's a marketing event for some of your clients, make sure that they're included. One of the suggestions was, assign them somebody else to kind of go with them to make sure they have a partner so that it's not awkward when they enter the room. It's not awkward to try and meet people. Maybe you have them go up to people to meet people, but maybe you also have somebody that brings people to meet them. I think that there's just different ways. The last thing you want is to invite somebody who has a disability and then put them off in a corner where you're not actually including them in the event. It's not enough just to invite somebody. You have to make them feel welcome, included, and there are certain things that you might need to do to make sure that happens. So I'm also kind of wondering if anybody else has any other ideas on that. Okay, I know it's early in the morning, but I have never seen a group of lawyers not be anxious to talk. This was not supposed to be just David and Carrie and me. So, Andrea, how about you? What comments do you have? Since it's got your name there, I'm going to start calling on people.
Good morning, Andrea. Can't get her. So, well, I was going to say, finding their buttons along the way. One of the points that you raised, and it touches on something Jim said a moment ago, and I do want to lift up again, what is invisible about us. And in your example of the reception, and at AHLA, we have a lot of receptions. It's a way for folks to network and connect, and it may work for many, it may not work for all. And lessons for us, like the tips you had, is folks are coming with someone who is aware enough to help them navigate the room. Because there's a lot of, I could imagine the great mystery about navigating the room when you're not able to or comfortable to. And when you overlay that with what may be invisible about us, it touches on how we really have to have that culture of openness and grace on both sides for folks to be able to speak comfortably and freely, that whatever they say will not be used against them, to say, I'm uncomfortable because, or I need assistance here because. And I think here, when we talked earlier about how we are still on our journey to have that true culture of inclusion for folks to be able to say that. Because again, when we don't know what we don't know, and we are planning our activities, and this is true for any organization, there's an expectation that everyone will fall in line with what we've planned and not necessarily be comfortable giving voice to what they may need that's different. And I would say here, and I hope that we are able to continue this in our own planning, to make sure that there's space for us to hear, and then also space for us to listen, learn, and adapt and make those changes to allow folks to be comfortable. And it is hard. And so what I'm asking is that both sides find comfortable voice and a level of respect and openness to receive as well as to give, so that we can collectively move on, because we don't know what we don't know. And it, as I said, I think it's particularly acute when things are more invisible.
Well, and I think one of the things that the pandemic has taught us is how accommodations that maybe should have been made before and are being made now, just because you do a lot of WebEx or Zoom conference calls. You do, the hours can be a little more flexible because you're working from home, different things like that, one of the things Joanne also said was, it was hard, I think, when she first started, for the partners to recognize that she could and was a valuable member of the organization, and that, maybe it did take her longer to do things. Maybe it did take, but as Jim said, she's extremely bright lady, very well regarded. But she also, kind of like what David's saying, there's a little give and take on both sides. She said, okay, because it took her longer, because it was not necessarily as profitable for the firm, you know, then she took some accommodations basically in the salary also, that, you know, she had to understand that with law firm economics, you know, it is to some extent about the money, and that there was kind of a give and take there and a little bit of a middle ground. So I think that that probably went a long way to having people at her firm recognize and value her commitment and value the resources that she brought to the firm.
Jim,
Hey everyone,
go ahead.
go ahead. Sorry, it's Andrea. I was having a little trouble unmuting myself earlier, but I wanted to kind of go back to the question that was raised a little earlier about including people in events and things. And I do remember going back sometime, trying to be inclusive and maybe not thinking ahead at some of the obstacles that maybe we don't recognize, that some people with disabilities may recognize right off the bat in terms of accessibility for events and things like that. And it strikes me that one thing that might be helpful is when you're inviting to ask folks what it is that you know, makes them excited about an event, and maybe get a conversation going to understand what the obstacles might be, because what might be obvious to them might not be obvious to you. Everyone has a different frame of reference, and it could be as simple as getting into the venue or navigating the room or so on.
I think that's an excellent point. It kind of reminds me that when, you know, if you're having a dinner and people have a choice, you know, you have to choose ahead of time what your entree is, or, you know, seems like there's usually a check the box, any allergies, you know, meat, fish, vegetarian, you know, that you have different choices. And I think sometimes if we knew ahead of time that there were things that needed to be done, I think that that would be helpful. So recognizing that it's not a burden to have to do it. It's just a choice that you're making, and it's a choice to be inclusive and to make sure that, you know, you're not just saying you're inclusive, but you're doing what needs to be done to make sure that you're inclusive, that the event's accessible, that, you know, for instance, if there, you know, are people that are hard of hearing, is there anything that you've done for accommodations for that? You know, like at church, they have, you know, pews with, you know, some sort of little sound system. So even if you have a hearing aid, sometimes that doesn't mean that you're hearing everything as well as everybody else that's sitting there. What else can you do to make sure that people can hear? You know, one of the things that I do sometimes when you're at a conference, and that is if I'm sitting in the back and I can't hear, I have learned not to be shy about raising my hand and saying, well, first I will usually, you know, speak to the person next to me and say, are you having trouble hearing? Like, is it just me? Or is this something that the whole room probably has trouble and they don't want to speak up? And then I have learned not to be shy and just to raise my hand and say, hey, I'm having a hard time hearing you. And it makes it so much better and the experience so much more enjoyable if the people in the room can hear. The last thing you want is at the end to get all these comments back that say, well, I couldn't really hear the speaker. It's like, okay, well, that's great, but you could have done something about it at the time. So, you know, thinking about what kind of needs to be done. Does anybody else have any comments on, you know, what we mean by disability inclusion and why focus on it?
Yeah, Kim, this is Jim again. I was going to add another comment here when we talk about inclusive practices. You know, think about also where we are today with, you know, the pandemic shift to video meetings like this one, because, you know, Zoom is great for people without disabilities, but it doesn't work as well with people, you know, for certain people with disabilities. Perhaps whether it's the you know, the audio or the chat room. And so, you know, as we so quickly pivoted into the use of these types of things, I'm not sure we necessarily have caught up to the opportunity to be inclusive in the way that we do it.
And I think that's, part of what this discussion is being mindful and being aware. And, those of us without disabilities, it is, I won't say it's hard. I mean, it's just, you just need to think about it. It's not like it's hard to make the accommodations. It's not like it's difficult to make the accommodations. It's just realizing that they need to be made. So it's kind of an awareness of what's going on and what's going on around you. And, one of the things, and you mentioned the Zoom, but one of the other things that came up when you think about inclusion is, what is your hiring process like? If you are just getting, that you need to be using artificial intelligence so that when you're looking at your talent pool, the pool includes people with disabilities, because otherwise, if you're not even making accommodations on the front end on how to submit a resume or what to do or how to set up, some sort of an interview process, then you're missing out on talent right from the start. So thinking about it just even at the very beginning of the process and the hiring process is how to take care of that.
And I think that's one of the points that Sharon had raised during the roundtable, that their organization is very intentional in creating internship, externship opportunities to reach out as a bridge, if you will, into the pipeline of getting folks through and getting them into the job market, offering them opportunities to demonstrate success. That's also, valuable, to Kim's point, in the hiring process. Because for many, you're right, I think the hiring process in and of itself is a barrier. And the mindset of those who are managing the hiring process is also a barrier. So I think, it is perhaps unintentionally keeping that tremendous talent out, and folks aren't even aware. And I also think, for a culture and a society with many barriers, individuals often self-select out, or they've encountered where I had resistance, I wasn't embraced, and therefore I'm going to stop trying. And then it's a lose-lose situation on both ends. There's tremendous talent that couldn't get in, and I think maybe it's part of the human nature. At some point, folks do get tired of trying to be heard. So I think your point's well made, Kim, is to look at our hiring, and not just the hiring piece, but how we engage after the hiring. So there's a lot of turnover and churn. Once folks work really hard, get folks in, and then they're not treated in an inclusive way, in a valued way, they don't stay long. And that investment that you talked about of time and money to bring folks on and orient them to your organization is lost, and you have to churn, and you're hiring again. And that, on the economic side, is a bad business deal.
And part of that, I guess, if you think about it, it's the intentionality, I think, is the big piece of it, that you need to be intentional. It's not really okay to be unaware. It's kind of when you're doing associate hiring anyway, and you have different people with different personalities, they need different things. You're trying to make sure that you retain that talent. And I think it's even more important that we retain the talent of the disabled lawyer. And I think that was something that this program really pointed out and brought home. So we do have a couple more questions. Hope we'll get a little more feedback on this. But, what has been your experience regarding accessibility and disability in your organization? And once again, keep in mind that we are not going to put out there that Jim Friend at Bricker said X, and, there'll be no quotes around what anybody says, but we do want kind of some discussion. And I mean, I point out that, I'm pretty new to Canal Gates, so I don't really know. I feel like it's very inclusive. I feel like they do work hard with their recruiting. My other law firm was much smaller. I don't think it had ever I don't think it had ever come up, at least not as far as I know. It was nothing that had ever been discussed at a level where I was, but, you know, I think it just hadn't come up. So I think sometimes you also have to be actively looking for people, and that's how you find some of the best talent. So Jim, I am going to pick on you a little bit because I know you are in management at your firm. Is it something that y'all have discussed? Is it something that's come up? Have you found it necessary to make certain accommodations or certain investments in, technology?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I mean, we have, and I'll be honest with you. I can remember an AHLA annual meeting presentation from a panel that included Joanne Lax, I think 2 or 3 years ago, that really opened my eyes on this. And I brought it back, and I brought back some of her takeaways from that session to our facilities people to say, let's look at some ways that we can make not just our own attorneys' experience, but our clients and guests' experiences, more accommodating. And so I think there are, we've also tried to incorporate some of those things into our hiring practices. And although the tip that you mentioned earlier is one that we haven't gone that far, but maybe we should. But it's a journey that we're in the middle of, I would call it.
Well, and I will just say it's roundtables like this that I think are opening a lot of people's eyes. It certainly had opened my eyes as well. And, I think the biggest point to being intentional about it and, really not just, oh, it doesn't affect me. What difference does it make? I think, like a 2-year-old, everything's all about them. And okay, we get that. That's sort of, but you don't want them to grow up to always be, it's all about them and not to be thinking about other people. So I'll just say it. You tell people now who have small children, because mine are grown, if they're doing something you don't want to be doing at 2 and 3 years old, you better be working on it now, because they grow up pretty close to what they are at 3 and 4 years old. It's kind of frightening. But, I think that as we do shift and as our age group does recognize things that need to be done, I do think that it is going to be better going forward.
Mark commented enabling closed captioning in Zoom video meetings. And I do think we need to be more intentional and turn that on so that then those who need the closed captioning find it helpful. One of the things too that I think we've been more intentional about or aware of is even on PowerPoint presentations that you're showing on Zoom, if someone has a vision impairment, they can't see the screen. So you have to describe what is in the PowerPoint, especially when there's, you want them to see something and do it, but if they have a vision impairment, they're not able to do that. So being more aware that you don't know who is in the room. And so to describe that PowerPoint presentation so that all can participate.
I think that's an excellent point. And I think that's something that you're right. Even AHLA, I think, as progressive an organization as we are, has had to be more mindful and more intentional. And certainly, having Joanne on the board has really helped with that. I think that that's been something that's been great for the organization. Because I do think that when, I think that traditionally when people thought about diversity, they didn't really think about disabilities. You thought about age, race, sex, sexual orientation, all of those types of things, but you did not necessarily, it's not one, I guess when you think about a protected class, that's kind of where you start with, the diversity. And disability is not one that you usually necessarily put in that bucket. And so being more mindful and intentional is something that we all need to, I know I need to work on it. Maybe there are others on this call who are already there, but I suspect that there's a lot of people who still need to work on it.
I would say we're probably on that journey. We're better today than we were, yesterday, and we still have to stay on the journey. And I think the pandemic highlighted a lot of great opportunities. And as we did pivot to Zoom, you're right, Zoom's not perfect in all cases. it still left people out as much as it brought others together. And one of the key things for us is to make sure, as you said, Kim, we are intentional as we are working our way out of COVID and coming together as we used to. We can't assume or think that before COVID we were perfect, because we were not. And we want to learn throughout this process and continue to adapt and be much more intentional. So as we come out of COVID, our offerings and our engagements are more intentional and inclusive than they were before. Just going back to 2019 isn't going to help us and help the community do better. We have to do better. And
right. I mean, I think it's a journey. And while we've been kind of gradually doing that journey, all of a sudden, I think that we've recognized that we need to speed it up a little bit, that we're better than we were yesterday. Hopefully we'll be better tomorrow than we are today. And I think that, I look at it a lot, I have 25 and 27-year-old kids. So they're grown, they're adults, they're in the workforce. And I think that their generation gives me a lot of hope that it is getting better. It will be better still. And, I think that that's really good.
And I do embrace that, Kim. And I think that COVID and seeing the new generation entering the workforce and what they are expecting and demanding suggests to me that we are still on that arc of change to learn to accept and embrace the whole individual, not just what we expect in our office culture, but what they bring to the office culture, who they are as an individual with the talents and the experiences they have coming into the culture and how that elevates the organization. And that arc, I think we're still learning, because I think, back in the day, or there's an expectation in our early orientation to businesses that you come and adapt to us. This is our box, this is our mold. I am only going to hire folks who look and think like us. It's a general philosophy that has carried this country through many generations. Your comment does suggest to me that we're on that journey to be better by recognizing what individuals bring to the organization that may also help us change the culture for the better. And I see that as a sea change that I want to make sure that we as an association are part of fostering that.
So we do have one last question, and I think this one kind of is a little bit of a tipping point almost. And what would you like leaders at your organization to know or do better? What are the things that really do you think would help with that tipping point? What are things that we do need to do in order to be able to move forward? I think that some of the things that came up from the roundtable that we had before, and Jim mentioned that their organization has been doing, is an investment. I mean, it takes money. It's not just resources, but it is money. And investment in technology, the closed caption, and really, I think almost even an investment in training your people. And like Carrie said, that, recognizing that there may be some people who, if they can't see your screen, what do you need to do to make sure that they get the same benefit out of what's going on or the meeting as someone who does have their sight? So it's kind of, what are we doing? And I know we've spent a lot of time on this talking about sight, just because it's one of those that is, to some extent, maybe the hardest. I would say almost sight and hearing might be some of the hardest that you do need to do. The wheelchairs, some of that is, building and recognition, what they're doing. I mean, I don't know if y'all know, familiar with the governor of Texas, but Greg Abbott is in a wheelchair, and he is a lawyer. He graduated from Vanderbilt Law School. And anyway, you don't need the whole personal history, but he was not disabled. He was not born disabled. He was running when he was studying for the bar review in Houston. He had accepted a job in Houston, and there had been a storm. And he and another guy that were going to work at what the firm at the time was Butler Binion were running, and a tree fell on him. and caused him to lose the use of his legs. And so this is somebody who was, probably 25, 26 years old. And I think, talk about adapting. I mean, he went from, able-bodied out running to all of a sudden being in a wheelchair. It certainly didn't affect his mind, but I would bet that there are more accommodations in public buildings in Texas than there were since he's been active in politics. So I think that that's something that, that has been good. So I think it is something that's, a lot of what resources would be available. Does anybody have any other comments on that? There's some things in the chat room. I don't know if everybody said it, but talking about rearranging your office space, consider accommodations. I think this is interesting that most workplace accommodations cost less than $500, and almost a fair number don't cost any at all. Can you move the furniture to make space for a wheelchair? Are your hallways large enough? Do you have, are your doors to your offices large enough that somebody in a wheelchair can come in? Is there space to move around? I think a lot of places do have to have handicapped access, but what about your own personal space when you're building it out? What are you kind of taking care of? I know that for instance, I was involved with one of the Greek organizations on Vanderbilt's campus, and when they did some significant renovations, they had to at least put in elevator access, and they chose to go ahead and put in the elevator. But just when somebody would come through that needed the access, and I think right after they had been required to do it, that they did have somebody go through recruitment that was in a wheelchair. So it was good that they had the ability to get to the upstairs of the house. I think we're running close on time. I don't know if anybody has any questions, but one of these other comments in the chat room is saying, can you put Braille on the buttons of the kitchen's microwaves? I don't know, but that's certainly something that would be interesting to know. So I think that one of the comments that came out of this last roundtable is that, there's an onus on the able-bodied person to ask, and to ask in a way that doesn't offend, and, learning what might be helpful. But there's also an onus on the disabled person not to be prickly or to be defensive, but to be open to the person asking and not assume that the intent was to offend. I think that, courtesy, I think, goes a long way. Something that you do with anybody else that you thought might have an issue. I mean, certainly here in Nashville, you usually hold the door for somebody. You hold the door for a female, you hold the door for somebody older, things like that. I think that you would just normally do, also help for somebody that might be in a wheelchair. And I think just not to assume that we're trying to offend. I mean, I think that we're all in a learning process, that these opportunities create moments of education for both parties, both the able-bodied and the disabled, to learn and to connect and to grow. And I think that if we take advantage of this, and if we continue to have discussions like this, that we will be able to do things better in the future. And I think that's what we're all going for, is that, yesterday we can't do anything about. We can only do things for today and tomorrow and even farther into the future, and hoping that, maybe even a short time from now, that the discussion might be, everybody's doing this, everybody's doing that. These things work great, but boy, there's even one more little thing that we can do. But if we can just get to kind of the base level of accommodations that need to be made for people with disabilities, that would be a great position to be in. So I do want to thank all of y'all for your participation. Sorry, I did call on a few people. Mark, you got lucky since I didn't call on you. I did think about it. So do appreciate y'all being here. Thank you for your support, and take advantage of more of the offerings that AHLA Week has to offer. I think that, one of the things that is happening this year is there are a lot more offerings because we are virtual. So I know I'm going to take advantage of a fair number of them and hope that y'all will too. Thank you. And next year, for gosh sakes,